Good afternoon. We Presbyterians are known, among other things, for our emphasis on providence and predestination. That is, we emphasize that part of our Christian faith that says that God guides the events of the world around us and that God has chosen us for salvation. Now, this is not a belief that sits well with many people, including some Presbyterians. After all, we believe in free will. We have choices. None of us want to think that we're puppets with God pulling the strings and we have no choice but to go where He leads us. However, that's not quite what providence and predestination are all about. That's more like fatalism or mindless robot-like conformity. And that is not what God desires for us. The concepts of providence and predestination made the most sense for me the way they were explained when I was in seminary. One of our professors told us that we live life as though we have free will. We are making choices, we make decisions freely, but we only see God's guiding hand at work when we look back at the past. In other words, providence and predestination are about having 20/20 hindsight. We have choices and we have decisions to make, and we make them, and all options are available to us. But after we've made those choices, we can look back and see how God used our choices to advance His will for our lives and our world. Perhaps He does it by subtly guiding our choices in a way we're not aware of. Perhaps God incorporates our completely free decisions into making His great plan. Perhaps it's something completely different. God's will is dynamic and active. It will always lead to the same goal that God has in mind, but we don't always get there using the same path. And at various points along the way, we may be utterly confused. It may look as though there's no plan for our life at all. We feel as though we're fumbling around in the dark, only making a mess out of our lives and everyone around us. But at other times, we can look back and we can see the course that our lives have taken, and we can recognize clear as a bell that God was guiding us through it all. And that is what we Presbyterians call providence, which means God guides the events of the world, and what we call predestination, meaning that God is leading us to salvation. We trust that even in those bewildering, chaotic times, God is still at work, and His will continues to guide us. We find a perfect example of this in the Bible in the life of Joseph. The story of Joseph takes up the better part of the last 13 chapters of the book of Genesis. Joseph was the youngest of 12 sons, and his older brothers were jealous of him. He was daddy's favorite, and he was always boasting about how special he was until finally they had enough. They kidnapped Joseph and sold him into slavery and watched as he was being led off to the land of Egypt. Then Joseph's brothers told their father that wild animals had killed him. Now, as if being a slave in a foreign land wasn't bad enough for Joseph, while he was a slave, his master's wife accused him of assaulting her, and Joseph was thrown into the dungeons. At that point in time, it's hard to imagine that Joseph sensed God was guiding the course of his life. It just seemed as though things were getting worse and worse for him. A person of lesser faith would have given up hope. They would have lost faith in God. But Joseph persisted. And eventually, through a strange twist of circumstances, Joseph rose from being a prisoner in the dungeon to becoming prime minister of the land, second only to King Pharaoh in authority over all of Egypt. And he got to that position just in time, because God guided Joseph to know that they needed to save the bumper crops from the wonderful harvests they were having, because a famine was coming and they would need every morsel of that food to survive. So, under Joseph's leadership, Not only did the people of Egypt have enough to eat during the famine, but they were able to sell food to other people who came begging for it. Those other people included Joseph's very own brothers, the ones who years before had sold him into slavery. Now, Joseph was able to use his position of authority to save his entire clan from famine. Understandably, Joseph's brothers were afraid that now that Joseph had almost supreme authority and power over them, he would take revenge on them for what they did to him. But instead, Joseph said to them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Throughout this week, I'm talking about the fact that God guides us if we pay attention. At times, paying attention to God's guidance means trusting that He is guiding us, even when we can't see how. Even at times when we feel like Joseph rotting away in a dungeon, we still believe that God continues to have plans for our lives and continues to make those plans work. Would you pray with me, please? Lord, perhaps today some of us are feeling like Joseph in the dungeon, feeling as though our lives are spinning out of control, simply getting worse and worse, and we can see no way out of it. In such times, Lord, give us the courage to have faith and to have hope. Give us the courage to trust that even in the darkest times, we are still held in your hands and you are still guiding the course of our lives toward the future you have desired for us. Give us faith, Lord, even at the times when we can only see your guidance when we look in the rearview mirror. Help us to trust that it indeed is there. Amen. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk again later.